evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, welcome to everybody. As you can see, we do have a very full room this evening, as we were oversubscribed for this opportunity to hear from the various political parties their ideas and proposals for the private rented sector after the general election. And I do apologise for the venue change, but our original rooms needed by the Transport Committee and Parliamentary Business does take precedence. Just a reminder for those who've come in lastly, please put your phones on silent. If you want to tweet, it's hashtag NLA Hustings, and we do have our own photographer here, and this room is being audio recorded to make you aware of that. Now, to introduce myself, I'm Carolyn Uphill. I'm chairman of the National Landlords Association, which is the largest independent trade association working directly with over 56,000 landlords, and in the interests of some 1.4 million landlords with every size of portfolio, from just one house to thousands of property. We operate as a trade association to support landlords and to protect their interests by campaigning for an equitable legislative framework, and also to promote good standards in this sector. Now, there's no doubt that the private rented sector is a vital part of housing provision in this country. It's now providing some 19% of all homes, according to the very latest English Housing Survey. And that housing has also come to the top of the political agenda as a result of problems which arise from a chronic undersupply, most notably in areas of highest demand like London. Although I do hope that the debate tonight will recognise the differing markets which exist around the country, and not just the particular issues which face the capital and the bad publicity created by a minority of criminal operators. Now, my job tonight is to allow each party to set out its views and then take and answer questions in a balanced format, so I would ask everybody to keep their points and questions succinct. And I should warn you that I will curtail any long speeches so that we do have an opportunity to hear from as many people as possible, and we are able to consider all points of view. I'm going to start with a 3-minute introduction from each of our panellists. I'm going to be strict again on those 3 minutes. And then I'm going to table those questions which were posed by our membership, those members who responded to our viral Marcom's Rent, Risk and Resolve campaign, according to the priority, the top priority given to each issue. After that, I'm going to throw the event open to the floor to allow for questions and follow-ups. So just to start off, I want to introduce our panel and thank them all most sincerely for agreeing to join us and take part in this debate. I do know that due to the pressure of parliamentary business, the Minister will have to leave us very promptly at 7. So it's my pleasure to welcome, I'll go through them all first before we start, Stephen Williams MP, who's the Liberal Democrat Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, although tonight Stephen will speak in his party political rather than his ministerial role. Bob Neal MP is Conservative Party Vice Chairman for Local Government. Emma Reynolds MP is the Labour Shadow Housing Spokesman, and Tom Chance is the Green Housing Spokesman. UKIP were invited to put up a speaker, but they declined to attend. So I'm going to start off with the questions that have been put forward by our membership. And the first question, which I'm going to put to Stephen Williams, is: the governments in Scotland and Wales are both committed to landlord registration. Would your government follow their example? Stephen?
Right, I didn't realise we were going straight into questions.
Sorry, no, forgive me. No, I do forgive me. I've said what I was going to do and then I've not done it. Sorry, Steve, would you like to do your introduction? My apologies.
Right. It's 3 minutes, isn't it? You want us to take. First of all, it's slightly difficult to separate my government hat from my political hat, because I've been involved for the last 18 months as Communities Minister in putting in place quite a lot of legislative changes and administrative changes affecting the private rental sector, largely to increase security for the tenant and to put all letting agencies into an ombudsman scheme, to insist on transparency over letting agency fees. But I think that's actually good for responsible landlords as well, because if you have tenants who feel that they are getting a fair deal, then you're likely to have more responsive customers as well. Going forward, I think the private rental sector is going to play a very important role in housing flexibility going forward. Lots of people obviously do wish to gain ownership of their own home, and that's an entirely normal aspiration for people to have. Sadly, though, we know that is something that is often difficult now for people to attain. I met a private sector tenants group in my constituency last Friday. I was telling them about my typical journey through the private rental sector, from a one-room bedsit after I graduated, then to a two-room bedsit, then to a one-bedroom flat, then finally buying. I was able to do that in between the age of 21 and 30. But a lot of young people now, including my own city of Bristol, where prices are very high, are resigned to the fact that they will probably be living in the rented sector probably well into their mid-30s. And that's a societal challenge that all three parties of government, at least, are going to have to address in the next Parliament. But how do we build more housing stock to tackle that affordability issue? And one of the things that I would like to see is more purpose-built private rental sector accommodation being built, into which people can invest for the long term, either directly and personally, or perhaps via their pension fund. I was on a visit this morning to the Bath Riverside scheme, a major regeneration project in the city of Bath, which will have a significant purpose-built, and I saw the block going up, private rental scheme development taking place there. So I think the PRS, you're looking at me as to say, quiet please, it does have an incredibly important future, whether it's in the traditional sector of sort of converted properties or in purpose-built.
Thank you, Stephen. Bob Neal.
Well, thank you. I was for a time a local government minister myself, and I ought to say, if you look at my register of interests, I am a landlord in the sense that I have one property, so I'm an accidental landlord, but I'm conscious of the importance of the sector, and our party take the view that the private rented sector is a key part of the mix. I agree with Stephen that it's part of the flexibility that you need in types of housing tenure. As a London MP, I'm conscious of that. It's not only a question of people's journey up through the housing ladder, exactly like mine, starting off renting and then eventually move on to ownership, but also in many of the big cities, particularly now that you've got a more international population, people move around, and often people will, as a matter of choice, prefer to rent for a significant part of their time. So what we want to do is to get the balance right between, first of all, encouraging and supporting the responsible private sector landlord. Majority of landlords in the UK are individuals or smaller scale companies. We want to support the good operators. We want to encourage more institutional investment. I think that's a key part of the future of the sector. We want also to have a fair set of balance between the obligations and rights of landlords and tenants as well. I think we've been seeking to achieve that in the course of the current coalition government. We think actually that sensible regulation is necessary, but we don't want to over-regulate, because experience shows that if you over-regulate, you drive away investment. You actually make it harder for the people who are playing by the rules, and you make it harder to bring in the fresh investment that the sector needs. So we see it as striking a sensible balance, and I'll go through when we answer the various questions in a moment, Carolyn, where that leads us on to the specifics around things like rent control licensing and other matters.
Thank you, Bob. Emma.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, and thanks to the NLA and all of you for coming this evening. I think it's safe to say that housing is rising up the political agenda. You will have seen that in the news today. Certainly it's a big priority for the Labour Party. As the Shadow Housing Minister, I attend the Shadow Cabinet. We're very focused on what Carolyn remarked on in her remarks, on the chronic undersupply of housing, particularly in the big cities, but not only. But it's also true to say, and I'm an MP in Wolverhampton, that there are different markets in different parts of the country that we need to be very attuned to when we're making policy. We want to see a more professional private rented sector where at the moment we have many good landlords, but we want to see even more good landlords, and we certainly want to see rogue landlords and chased out of the sector. We want more stability for both landlords and tenants, And that's why earlier last year we came forward with a suite of proposals. We want to make sure that 3-year tenancies are the norm rather than the traditional AST for 1 year, because we think that both landlords and tenants want greater security and stability. And we're not in favour of 1970s rent control. We want the market to set the rent originally, but there to be a ceiling. It may be inflation, it may be something else. We will consult on that in government on rent during the course of those contracts. We want to work with the good landlords and the NLA, who we're already working with, to make sure we get these reforms right, because it's really important that they work in practice. And essentially, one of the things that we've discussed in the past, which I think is really, really important, is that the safeguards for landlords are secured in practice. So in our system, landlords would continue to have safeguards if tenants were irresponsible, caused damage to the property, or didn't pay their rent. If the landlord wanted to move back into the property or sell that property, they would also have the opportunity to end that 3-year tenancy. And we know that there are often problems with securing those safeguards in practice. That's something that we're very keen to work with you on. We want to introduce a light touch national register of landlords, where you would only have to provide contact details, but we also want to make sure that councils, where they want to do this, and it would be at their discretion, given their knowledge of the local area, introduce licensing schemes should there be a need in their local area. I think very finally, I would say, we also want a professional letting agent sector. We have put amendments in the Lords on a certain bill recently about client money protection insurance for landlords and tenants when it comes to letting agents. And we also don't want to see letting agents double charging fees for tenancies and for inventory fees and all those sorts of fees on both landlords and tenants. We think that's really important.
Okay, thank you very much. Tom.
Thank you. I've actually slightly lost my voice today, but I hope I haven't lost my mind as well in this. Just wanted to start with three numbers, 3/3 about the private rented market in the UK today. So 1/3 of private rented households now are families with children. When we talk about flexibility, I think we should remember we're not talking about a sector of the housing market as it was maybe 20, 30 years ago, where it's principally for people such as Stephen, young, flexible, wanting to move around a lot. 1/3 of landlords are thought to be amateurs with no training or qualifications, which is why I'm quite glad to come here this evening, because it's very good to see landlords taking their responsibilities seriously, being part of a professional association that has a big emphasis on training and on seeing themselves as a profession. And 1/3 of private rented homes fail the Decent Homes Standard, which is a very, very high proportion. And so the Green Party's approach is to, similar in some ways to Labour, to professionalise and improve the sector and ensure that it better provides secure, comfortable and affordable homes to the people who live in that sector. So we would introduce a national licensing scheme, somewhat similar to a registration scheme, but making it mandatory for all landlords to sign up, be run by local authorities and replace what I think is quite a confusing patchwork of voluntary accreditation schemes, selective licensing schemes, all sorts of other schemes run by different local authorities, which leave landlords and tenants often quite confused. That would provide training for landlords and support for landlords, as well as ensuring that landlords who weren't fit and proper to let out their homes lost the ability to do so, which touches on the rogue problem that is a particular problem in certain parts of the country. And local authorities ought to be able to also use this for much more proactive enforcement. One of the problems is that with the regulations that we have, they simply aren't enforced because local authorities are losing their health and safety or their environmental health officers. And so bad landlords offering out bad properties get away with it because the tenants don't know about their rights, don't know how to enforce them, don't want to try to enforce them, and then landlords continue to profit from it. We would introduce longer tenancy agreements. Perhaps shall I get into the detail of that a bit more?
I was going to say if we can just
after
the questions, yeah.
And so quite a similar stabilising rent control policy to the one that Emma described that Labour want to put out as well. One difference, though, is that while we think that there is definitely a supply problem in this country, we also think there's a major demand problem. There's a huge amount of excessive demand, and you see that in the media, often characterised as overseas investors buying up properties in central London. But in fact, the desire to see housing as an asset and an investment is in itself part of the problem in driving up prices and driving up demand in the housing market. And that means that You also need alternatives in private pensions. You need people to feel safe to be able to put their money in other places besides property. And Britain is quite unusual in people seeing it as an investment in quite the same way, particularly for capital gain, compared to other countries which have much larger, more stable and private rented sectors that work better both for landlords and tenants. So we want to get the balance right between having investment in housing, but not then having that investment drive the problem of unaffordability. Thanks.
Thank you very much to our panellists, and my apologies for putting you on the spot then, Stephen. I was ahead of myself on my own notes. So I am now going to put a question to you, which was one voted for by our membership. And the question is, the governments in Scotland and Wales are both committed to landlord registration. Would your government follow their example?
Well, we're not in favour of a sort of national database, a national register, but we are in favour of local authorities compiling their own. And also, at the moment, they can have discretionary licensing schemes in place, and that's working in one part of my constituency in Bristol. So we would leave it up to local authorities to decide whether they want to extend the scope, the geographical scope of those discretionary licensing schemes to have localised registers of landlords, because that, after all, is where the information is needed in order to deal with any problems that might arise, to find out who can be contacted, and that sort of information would be useful to a variety of people via the local authority. For instance, a lot of students in my city live in private rental accommodation. Some of it is managed via an agent, and they may not ultimately know who the landlord is. Quite often, constituents have issues with properties, but have no idea who they can turn to. So there are lots of practical reasons why you'd want to have a registration scheme for landlords, but broadly we don't favour, as Liberals, national registers of anything if you can possibly avoid it, but I do think it is something that local authorities should be empowered to do, to extend the discretionary licensing scheme that is currently in place.
Okay, my other panellists, Emma.
Obviously, there's a big difference between a register and a licensing scheme. So you asked about the register. We do intend to introduce a national register, but it would be a light touch register. And those professional, good landlords, many of whom I can see in front of me and who are members of yours, Caroline, have nothing to fear from that. It's simply to make sure that the local authority knows how to contact landlords should there be a complaint. And local authorities, in terms of their enforcement, and I agree with something that Tom said just now, is there is a problem with enforcement, and one of the biggest hurdles that local authorities tell us they face is actually finding the landlord in the first place. So it would enable local authorities to identify that landlord quickly and then go through all the different procedures that they need to go through to make sure that they are giving their tenants decent standards. And to echo something that Tom said, actually, a lot of the good landlords are here today, but there is a problem with standards in the private rented sector, with a third of those homes in the private rented sector, according to the English Housing Survey, not meeting decent home standards. So we do need to do more in this area.
Okay. Bob, would your government follow that example?
No, we're opposed to a national register, and we're also opposed to blanket licensing schemes. And I don't think you solve the genuine issue of dealing with the rogue landlord by placing extra burdens on the majority who play by the rules. So we wouldn't go down those routes. In relation to the register, what we have said is you tackle the real issue, which is to make sure that there's proper access to a fair redress scheme. That's why we've now, as you know, accredited 3 compulsory redress schemes. I think that's a more sensible and proportionate way forward. We've also, of course, now in the Consumer Rights Bill required all letting agents to publish a full tariff. And because we want to proceed on an evidence base, we said, well, let's look how that works over the next 12 months, and then we can take stock of the evidence there. I think that's a more proportionate way forward. Let's tackle specific problems rather than a blanket approach. In relation, and of course we've also got the Tenants' Charter and the Model Tenancy Agreements. So I think those are more sensible ways forward without a lot of bureaucracy at a national level. On the licensing, I think the power of selective licensing under Section 80 is the appropriate sort of tool. It could be localist done. It's their design, when you think about it, to deal with that mixture of poor landlords and low housing demand. And there the local authority has a discretion. We're not in favour of rolling that out on a national basis, and we're very wary of the attempts by Newham and one or two places to do a blanket approach to the whole of their local authority area. That's rather abusing what I think was the intention. So we prefer much more targeted interventions.
Thank you. Tom?
Well, we would have a national scheme that we feel it ought to be administered and held by local authorities, because like the Liberals, we're quite sceptical or nervous about the idea of national databases. On Newham specifically, one of the interesting things about Newham is they found when they did it, they had the help of the police to go round and try and identify who was renting privately. And they weeded out huge numbers of households that were private rented where they just didn't realise they had that many people. It's basically a way of them being able to get out there and do proactive work. And where they were finding good landlords, then they're able to, you know, more or less say, thank you very much, you've signed up to the scheme. You know, you've nothing to fear from it, as Emma was saying, from the national scheme. And there's obviously issues around costs of being registered or licensed. I think those can be kept down. Then you've got all the amateur landlords who got into it, perhaps as Bob, accidentally, or, you know, because they had a few, and then they don't really know what they're doing. They don't really understand what it involves to be a landlord. They don't sign up, by and large, to voluntary schemes. I mean, in London, the Mayor of London set up a scheme which has been advertised all over the Tube network and so on, and it's still only got about 14,000 landlords on it, which are probably all NLA members anyway. So the amateurs, it helps because you can get out there and talk to them and explain to them what their rights and responsibilities are. And then you've got all the rogue people who you didn't know about and you find. So that's why we're in favour of it. We think the evidence from where there have been selective licensing schemes shows that it's very positive.
Okay, thank you. I am open to some hands in the audience if anything gets anybody animated, but I think we'll move on to the next question. I think this may well get the audience a little bit more animated. Can I start by addressing to Bob Neal this question? If rent control is introduced, what will stop history repeating itself?
Well, the answer is, I think, nothing, and that's why my party is opposed to the introduction of rent control. I promise you, by the way, I didn't become a landlord because I'd had a few, but it just happened that I moved, like a lot of people, for work reasons, and therefore use exactly one of those accredited agents that many of us do with the scheme. But it highlights the point that we've got to be sensible about the way we approach this. Rent control, and however you dress it up, whether you call it a cap or whatever, didn't work when we had it in the UK between the 30s and the 80s. Not only did it drive down the stock, it also drove down investment, and that resulted in a deterioration in the quality of the stock. And that's not unique to experience in the UK. More recently, they tried it in New York with equally bad results. You had less investment. That meant lower supplies. They actually had fewer rented housings available, so that reduced flexibility in the stock. It actually pushed rents up to the top of the cap rather than anything else. And again, because landlords didn't invest or didn't have the incentive to invest in the same way, it drove down the maintenance, drove down the quality of the stock. So we think that will be a bad idea. What we want to do, in particular, of course, is precisely to encourage not just the smaller scale, I wouldn't call it amateur because people don't do it that way, the smaller scale investor, but we also do want to get more institutional money into the private rented sector. And again, rent controls will be a disincentive both to the smaller as well as the institutional investor, and that can't be right on either point of view.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Emma next because I know this is probably more directed at your party because you've proposed rent caps rather than rent controls. But is there a difference, and what would stop history repeating itself?
Well, firstly, let me say, rather irritated by not Bob, but one of his colleagues who described our policy as Venezuelan-style rent controls, which they are not. What happened prior to the 1980s, as you all know, is that rent controls actually determine the level of rent. We are not suggesting that we do that. We don't think we should do that. We think that could have very, very negative implications. We are simply saying that given there are now 11 million people renting from a private landlord, many of whom, nearly half are over the age of 35, lots of whom have children, that in order for the 3-year tenancy to have a meaning, there should be some sort of limit on the rent increase at the end of year 1 and the end of year 2 of that 3-year contract. Now, you don't have to go to Venezuela to find such a scheme. You only have to go to the Republic of Ireland or France or Germany or some of the other countries where private renting is more stable. In Spain, for example, they use a measure of inflation. In Ireland, they use average market rents. We would consult on what the best measure would be, but this is not rent control, and I do resent the way in which our proposals have been misrepresented.
Stephen?
Well, I mentioned earlier, because I'm a Liberal, I'm suspicious and generally opposed to national registers. Likewise, in economics, I'm a free market Liberal. So I think the state trying to control the price of something is ultimately going to lead to complete market breakdown and won't deliver the goal that I'm sure is a well-intentioned one, that those who are in favour of price controls set up. We have a classic supply and demand situation here, which is why rents are too high for a large number of people, and why house prices are very high, in particular in sort of economically prosperous areas such as Bristol or London. And that's simply because the supply side is wrong, because there aren't enough properties coming onto the market in order to stabilise prices for people who want to either rent or buy. I think whatever you want to call it, whether it's a rent control at the outset or whether it's a subsequent rent cap, it is still restricting people's ability to make a return from their asset. And the trouble with what Emma has suggested, and I noticed that there wasn't much detail behind it, you're going to consult in government as to what proxy would be used in order to subsequently fix a rent, if that's accurately describing what you said. It depends what that proxy is, doesn't it? I mean, a lot of members of Parliament are renters as well in the private sector in London. I am. My London flat is in the private rental sector, and I was an MP in the last Parliament when interest rates went up. In the first 2.5 years I was an MP in between 2005 and 2007, and my rent went up. So if you tied, just take Emma's policy, subsequent rent rises to, say, inflation, one of the obvious proxies you mentioned you might use. Interest rates have no resemblance at all to rises in inflation. They can sharply go up and they can dramatically come down. So my rent went up several times in between 2005 and the end of 2007. But the landlord's reasoning for that was her investment, her rate of interest she was having to pay that she used for the loan to buy the flat had gone up as well. Fortunately, she was quite a good landlord, so when rates collapsed, as of course they did, in 2008 have broadly stayed low ever since, she subsequently reduced the rent back to what it was in the first place. But I know that has not necessarily been everyone's experience. But that example simply shows how difficult it would be to find a single proxy to cap rents in the future. So I think the answer isn't trying for the state to try and control the price of anything, whether it's housing in the free market as opposed to the social and affordable sector, where obviously we do want to control the price because it's taxpayers' money going into that programme in the first place. I think the answer is to drive up the supply of properties coming onto the market.
Thank you. The interesting comments, because as I said earlier on, we shouldn't just concentrate on the London market, and although rents have risen dramatically in London, there are other areas in the country where they've remained static or even gone down, so it's not just the same market throughout the whole country. Tom?
Yes, we would introduce rent controls. Very similar model again to the one that Labour proposed to simply cap increases. It's a proposal that has been developed by Shelter, which we have supported for a number of years. And it's interesting to go back to something Stephen said. As a free market Liberal, I presume you support the planning system. Now, the planning system is a very, very, you could describe it as a sort of Stalinist state intervention into the market, because we restrict the supply of homes because we recognise there are other objectives besides having a housing market sprawl out over the countryside and deliver no education and schools for the residents and all the rest of it. This is an incredibly modest intervention in a market which is totally mainstream in most other rental markets in Europe. This is not 1970s rent control. And so to say, are you in favour of rent control, is like asking, are you in favour of the planning system at all? Well, most people in the world would be, and then there's a debate about what sort of planning system, there's a debate about what sort of rent control. It's also, I thought, interesting that Grant Shapps referred to Labour's proposal as Venezuelan style, because I don't know if you're familiar with the Venezuelan rent control system. It basically fixes the landlord's rate of profit. So you can make a reasonable rate of return based on the value of your assets, and then no more. So it's actually a profit, it's a sort of almost capitalist rent control. It's saying it's fine to make a reasonable rate of profit, but we don't think you ought to make an unreasonable rate. And I'm not suggesting that's our policy, but we need to have a bit of sense and proportion about this debate on rent controls, what sorts of controls we're proposing and why. Is it practical? Is it going to bring about the end of the rental sector? Well, clearly not, because the most famous, stable, largest rental sector in Europe has exactly this model of rent control in Germany.
I think some people might say the German model of private rented sector is slightly different.
There are many differences. Every housing market, but as Emma said, almost every other housing market in Europe has some form of limit on increases in rent, despite the many differences in the housing markets. I see no reason why it couldn't work in the UK.
Okay, thank you. That's the panellists' opinion. Is there any opinion anyone would like to share in the room? We've been very well behaved audience. Gentleman there.
Sorry, I'd like to ask a question to the panel, really. That if rent control is brought in, for example, in Milton Keynes, the recent local housing rate has been brought in for a two-bed, for example, is $650, which is below that of a private rented property. It's a bit of a complicated question.
Okay, we can try and keep it succinct so we can get through lots of questions.
If the rent is capped at $650 for a private rented property, the tax on that rent is going to be reduced, so the government will get less tax. How will the government of the day raise tax to cover the lost tax? Does that make sense?
Yes. What you're saying is where rents have increased, the government has actually benefited because tax is paid on those as profit. That's what you're saying.
The profit on the rent is reduced. So the tax is reduced, so the tax income is reduced to the government. Will the government look to recoup that loss in some other way by going to a landlord on a buy-to-let mortgage and say, similar to stamp duty, we're charging this? Okay,
so the question is, have the politicians thought about that particular knock-on effect, Emma?
Given that we're not going to introduce rent control, we don't need to worry about that. This is not rent control. We are not suggesting that we set the rent. We are suggesting that the market and the negotiation between the landlord and the tenant and sometimes the letting agent sets the initial rent. To do otherwise would, I believe, threaten that market. However, in order for the security of the 3 years to have any meaning whatsoever, for many families out there who may have various commitments to the local area, including having their kids in a local school, if you just have the 3 years and you have nothing that says you have a limit on the increase, that 3 years becomes meaningless, because if in the worst case a landlord wants to evict a tenant and then put the rent up by 20%, that is clearly unfair. In the Republic of Ireland, they brought in 4-year tenancies with the same system of the market setting the initial rent and limits on rent increases. And you can find measures of inflation that also represent housing costs. So we do need to look at that. And I do take your point, Stephen, about rates of interest and things like that. So we need to make sure that landlords are in a reasonable position as well. But we need more stability for those tenants, especially those tenants who have children, because at the moment all they're seeing is a 6-month security period, after which they don't know from 1 year to the next whether they're going to be moved out or the rent's going to be hiked. So this isn't rent control. We are not suggesting we set the rent in any way. So I don't think the concern that you have would arise.
Okay. I would like to take a couple of more if I can. There's 3 hands up. I'm going to take all 3 of you. Brief questions, please, and then ask the panel to reply. So first of all, the gentleman at the back with his hand up.
Yeah, I think you probably have a couple of things. I have, for example, a property with a family and their children, and it's a 3-year lease. It goes up by inflation. It's the maximum of the RPI every year for 3 years. That can be in place already.
Yeah, fine. Let's see more of that. But it's not happening in a lot of places. That's the problem.
If we can take a few comments and then come back to the panel. Gentlemen,
I think you've got a big problem in the first place by the idea that everybody's going to have a 3-year tenancy. A lot of landlords are going to be put off immensely by feeling that they're under that pressure. So if you want to go down that route, you must have a 6-month break or something that's going to work, because whether a single person or a family, a great deal can go wrong, but the landlord will not want to risk. And you need to know that option. My market is the HMO market. There's no way that I and a lot of people I know would give an initial tenancy of 3 years in that market. Okay, it needs to be fluid as well as on both sides.
Gentleman in the pale blue at the front.
I was going to ask,
what clauses would there be to dissolve the 3-year contract?
Okay, so the questions actually all seem to be coming around to 3-year contract rather than any other specific issue. The question really is generally, will having a 3-year contract kill the flexibility of the market? Is that what everybody's saying?
What I would like to ask is, would the tenant be committed to the 3-year as well?
Does it work both ways?
Oh, yes.
Okay, right, well, I'm going to take those questions, then we'll come back to the audience in a minute. Bob, do you want to come in and then I'll go back to...
Yeah, I think actually this highlights the problem of having a one-size-fits-all approach to it, because for some people a 3-year contract is going to be right and a good thing, but ultimately you're right, this is a free negotiation, and what I want to do is to see more supply in the sector to start with. I agree with Steve about that in the housing sector generally. I think actually you are most likely to get 3-year contracts or longer tenancies generally. It needn't be a magic figure. Again, if you're able to get more institutional money in, because by the nature of it, the institutions or people put through pensions or whatever are going to be much more interested in yield rather than the capital gain. So they're going to be in a position, because of their business model, to actually let out on a longer period. You don't want to put those folk off by having, whether you call it a cap, whether you call it a fixed period of tenancy, which doesn't give them flexibility to respond to the market during that period. What you should be doing is to make sure, on the other hand, that you have good tenancy agreements which are sensibly and mutually enforceable on both sides. That's what we've sought to do, for example, with the model tenancy agreements, with the tenants' charter, with the family-friendly model that we have put in. I think that's a much more sensible approach than trying to impose a one-size-fits-all. And as you fairly say, Karen, within the country, the sector is different, and of course, overall, if you take London out of it, I suspect probably since 2010, rents probably across the piece, if anything, dropped. So we're not really looking, I think, at the right solution to try and impose from the centre.
Okay, Stephen, would you like to make a comment?
Well, we're not in favour of mandatory three-year tenancies, but we do think there should be a model 3-year tenancies, broadly what the government has advocated in the model tenancy agreement that we published about 6 months ago. But that would have in it a 6 months probationary period to try and answer what you were saying, so that if it wasn't working out in between the landlord and the tenant, that there would be an opportunity after 6 months to have that break. But the 3 month tenancy should be something that landlord and tenant mutually agree to. The 3-year tenancy should be something the landlord and tenant agree to mutually at the start of the tenancy agreement, but equally there may be tenants who only want to have a 1-year agreement or a 2-year agreement, because people are on that journey of moving up from smaller units of accommodation as their economic circumstances change. Or their family circumstances change.
Tom, did you want to make a comment on this?
Yes, the question about Milton Keynes, like Labour, our proposal wouldn't be setting the initial market rent, or the initial rent at the beginning of the tenancy period, so it wouldn't bring the rent down, it wouldn't create that problem. One of the other things is that, in terms of cost to government, the major reason for the increasing benefit bill has been the rise in rents and the fall in people's wages, and the increased caseload, because people simply can't manage to pay their rents with the incomes they've got. It's not about unemployment or, it's principally about rent, so that there are savings to the government in terms of a reduced benefit bill, as well as costs in terms of potentially less tax revenue through landlords. And I imagine, we haven't done any detailed econometric modelling on trying to work out what that would be. And I think if you look at this government's record on benefit bill savings on housing benefit, you see the sort of foolishness of thinking you can predict that anyway, to that kind of level of accuracy 5 years ahead. On break clauses, we quite like the approach the Irish government introduced, where you have a 6-month initial tenancy, which then, if that continues, rolls on for another 3.5 years, so you get 4 years. So a landlord who has, it's like a probationary period, a landlord who gets a tenant in who causes real problems, or there's an issue in the first 6 months, you can deal with it then. And it has to be a quid pro quo, so the longer the tenancy agreement for the tenant, the longer the notice period the tenant ought to give. And so we think probably a 2-month notice period for tenants is reasonable. Just on the idea that you can get longer tenancy agreements in the current market, of course you can, and I hope many of you in this room would look favourably on it if your tenant asked. But I used to be a tenant of Granger, which I think is the largest private landlord in the country. They refused me and my wife and our family the ability to get a longer tenancy agreement. Even though I asked them, we said we could even come to an agreement about rent increases over that period. They wouldn't give it to us because it's not in their business model. I had a friend who works for a bank. She's not poorly paid by any means. She spent about 8 months trying to find a landlord who would give her a tenancy agreement that was longer than 1 year. Did eventually get it, but it took a very long time. Also a friend who has a young daughter, and she and her husband were trying to find a longer tenancy agreement somewhere near where their kid goes to school. And then they couldn't, and then they had to move out the area, out the catchment area, and their child left. That school and went to another school. So it's all very well saying that it's possible, but you're talking here about people's lives and their homes, and it's not an equal negotiation. The boot, particularly in high-demand areas, not just London, many parts of the country have a real imbalance of supply and demand. The boot is very much on the foot of the landlord in those situations, and then there are doubtless parts of the country where the boot is very much on the foot of the tenant. It's not always an equal relationship.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to come back to Emma now. Obviously, this 3-year tenancy issue is one of concern in the room, so I'll phrase it with a question that was one of those questions voted for. Sure. Why should I remain a landlord if your party forms the next government?
Okay, maybe you should ask that to everybody as well, given it came from there.
I'm sure you will.
I'm sure you will. Well, look, I think that the demographic of the group of people who are privately renting has fundamentally shifted because there are lots of people now in high demand areas, and it's not only London, Brighton, Bristol, Oxford, York in some cases, that they can't afford to buy their own home, so they are actually privately renting in some cases forever, and they've lost the hope of owning their own home. So the market, the demographic of the group who are renting has changed, and the rules around what a tenant can demand and what rights they have hasn't changed along with it. So there are lots of families who want to have much more security and peace of mind, especially but not only those families with children. So we think that people should have the right to a 3-year tenancy. Now, we also need to make sure that there is a balance, obviously, and that landlords have protections and safeguards. So if they have the unfortunate occasion of having a bad tenant who doesn't pay the rent or damages their property, that they have those protections in place. So to answer the specific question about what the get-out clauses are within those 3 years for landlords, they would fall into the following categories. If the tenant falls into rent arrears, if they're guilty of antisocial behaviour or breach their tenancy agreement, if the landlord wants to sell the property for one reason or another, or that they need it for their own family use. It may be that they've moved out to work somewhere else, or it may be that somebody's gone into care but they was able to live independently again. So for all of these reasons, the landlord will be able to regain their property in those cases. But we do need more security for those people who are renting. Equally, we would have a 6-month probationary period at the end of which, the tenant and the landlord had a bit of flexibility. And to come to the point about HMOs, there will obviously be students and young professionals and others who don't want a 3-year tenancy. So in our system, they would be able to ask for a shorter term tenancy, which I think would probably cover your point, because we know that, there are lots of students I was in the lovely Bristol on Friday night. I am, on any questions at your wonderful university. There are lots of students who want shorter term tenancies, and I know that Carolyn, you rent to a lot of students. So there would be flexibility within that, but we do think that families, couples and others should have the right to a longer term tenancy, because many of them are settling in this sector now, which is totally different to what it was 20 or 30 years ago.
Okay, I'm going to ask the panellists that same question in a minute, but there was a few people who wanted to ask questions. I'll bring the audience in again. Richard, briefly.
Yes, I have a question on a slightly different topic. Is that okay at this moment, Caroline, or
it's
not?
about why any of us should remain landlords if any particular party gets
Well, this
in.
is about Article 4. I think it will be of interest to people. Local authorities have been given the powers to ban landlords from letting to sharers through Article 4 directions. 4 North and East London boroughs have taken this step. House shares are a vital source of housing for young people in our city, and we risk creating a greater housing shortage for them in the future across a whole swathe of North and East London. Do you agree with many landlords and sharers that these powers should be abolished?
Okay, so I'll take 1 or 2 points and then come back to the panel. There was another hand over there. Yeah, gentleman in the middle.
About capital gains tax. About the older purchases, there is a base price set at 1982 price, quite arbitrarily, and it has stayed at that level for many years. Now, 1982 prices were in a different era, and it is unfair to calculate capital gains on the basis of 1982 prices. It should be changed to, say, year 2000, and then it should be moved year by year. And also, when a landlord sells a property to reinvest in another property, there should be a rollover relief, as is being done in America and some other countries. And taper relief has been abolished, which is again very unfair, because number of years of ownership should be taken into account. Otherwise, alternatively, the annual CGT relief should be allowed to carry over next year.
Okay, so your point is about capital gains, not recognising landlords as business and not moving the benchline. Was there one other hand? Yes, there's one hand over there.
This 3-year thing that you were mentioning about some of the banks don't allow us to rent to tenants for 3 years. I personally prefer to have tenants stay there forever. What do I think? I just pay the rent, yeah? That's what I prefer. And I also prefer to pay it on a regular basis. But this thing is an issue. The other thing is this thing that you mentioned about some of the they're saying that the interest that you pay should be taken out of your tax return or whatever. I think one of the parties are mentioning that interest, for instance, on tax return or whatever. So that's another thing you mentioned. I think the Green Party is mentioning that actually.
Okay.
So that's another thing which quite against that. And this thing that the councils again talking about, want to know who the landlords are, have to register it. Who has to pay for it? We have to pay for that. Again, we have to charge the tenants. Why do you need that? I mean, if landlords don't get away, you have the need of landlords anyway. So why do you actually need that? It is extra registration.
Okay, well, some worries about present conditions, some worries about changing. If I can go back to the panellists now with that same sort of question, why should any of us remain landlords? If your party forms the next government, what would you do to keep landlords happy, shall we say, or reassure them about their worries? Tom?
Well, I'm sure you wouldn't want me to be in government, based on what I've said so far, but I think that we believe that there is a place for private landlords in a professional sector, much like in the European mainstream, and that's where we want to take the private rented sector in Britain. One other thing that we will be unveiling, and I can't give the details of because they haven't been worked out yet, and there's still some debate about it, is around the quality of housing, which we've touched on with the 1/3 not being decent, and the difficulty that private landlords have sometimes in making extensive investment in repairs, is a very substantial public investment in refurbishment of property up and down the country, including private landlords, particularly looking at energy efficiency, which would also make your properties much more attractive to tenants. And we think for a number of years that governments have sort of faffed around with this really, and also not really taken account of the particular problems that landlords face, because landlords don't get the immediate financial benefits from refurbishing property the tenants do, and that's often led to it's part of the reason why the sector is in a worse state of repair than, say, the social housing sector. So we want to really invest in a high quality private sector, not just in terms of the skills and professionalism and affordability and so on, but also the condition. If I could just address a couple of the questions as well.
Quickly, yes, please.
Yep. I was asked specifically about the mortgage interest relief. Yes, we would scrap it because we think that it's not a business expense; it's an investment thing. And there have been rulings by the Upper Tier Tribunal on exactly this point. That property letting is, the interest on the mortgage is about your capital gain on your investment and not about running your business. And just quickly also on Article 4, I'm very sympathetic. The party doesn't have a specific policy on Article 4 and whether it ought to be scrapped, so I couldn't say, but I do worry sometimes that local authorities use it as a populist campaign against students and against other certain groups of tenants where local people don't want them in the area, and so they try to restrict the supply of housing for the wrong reasons. I couldn't say whether or not we would get rid of it.
Okay, thank you very much. Stephen, and if you can answer the question and also any points that you pick up from the audience.
Well, in terms of the general question, we do think, Liberal Democrats do think the private rental sector will continue to provide an incredibly important part of the mix of tenures that have to be available to people and should be flexible. There should be a suite of tenancy agreements that people can negotiate in between landlord and tenant. The letting agency, there is often the broker for that negotiation, should be quite heavily regulated, and actually this government with myself and the Housing Minister presiding over that, have, I think, put in place, for at least the 12-month review that we've said, sufficient regulation over letting agents to make sure that tenants, or landlords for that matter, aren't being ripped off. Now, coming to the specific question, I favour Article 4 directions, and so I'm going to disappoint you on that front, and the Green representative as well. Article 4 directions should be sparingly used by local authorities. It shouldn't be used on a blanket basis right across a local authority, but they should be used on a targeted basis for particular areas where they think the community has got out of balance. And the fact is, in many university seats, this is right across a political spectrum in Parliament, from members of Parliament from the Liberal Democrats, Labour and Conservatives, in the last Parliament, all belonged to a balanced and sustainable communities group, where we persuaded, eventually, having gone through successive housing ministers under the last Labour government, to change planning law to have a separate use class for HMO student properties. That, as I'm wearing my party hat, I can safely say this, was a major mistake, I think, by Grand Chaps cancelling that within weeks of this coalition coming to office. So local authorities are left with Article 4 directions to pinpoint areas where they think the balance has become imbalanced, where in what is, at first appearance, is a normal residential street of family houses, is gradually over time become a student village, and that certainly happens.
Four whole boroughs of East London. 4 whole boroughs of East London. It's not just students. It affects all young
I'm not in
people.
favour of blanket borough-wide or city-wide Article 4 directions. It's not what Article 4 is for. It is for specifically ring-fencing particular areas where we say, thus far and no further, in terms of a particular development, rather like protecting particular assets in communities as well. They could be used to protect pubs from being converted, for instance. On capital gains tax, and I didn't quite I must admit, I didn't quite understand the capital gains tax question, and I was a tax consultant before I became an MP. When your base cost, I would have thought, for a future capital disposal is your acquisition cost. I didn't quite understand the 1982 valuation point you were making, but maybe that's something we could look at. And on the income tax point, I'm glad someone asked that, because while Tom is very articulately putting across Green Party viewpoints compared to his leader last week, of course, the enormous elephant, you should have been on rather than poor Natalie, the enormous elephant with a big trunk waving around the room here, as far as the Green Party is concerned, is they will effectively bankrupt the whole lot of you by saying that the interest cost of financing the capital in the first place should be non-tax deductible. I mean, that is frankly bizarre economics. I don't know whether you're against the interest cost of buying a piece of machinery or anything else that a business might buy, but it's an interesting view on how the economy works if you're going to abolish finance costs from being tax deductible. I think the whole of British industry, as well as the property sector, would go out of business overnight. I think you really do need to think that through.
Only for mortgages for landlords, because it's not a
Just
business
landlords.
expense.
It's just you guys.
Well, first of all, legal challenge.
First of all, because a Conservative government wouldn't try and put you out of business like that. Actually, I go further than that. Not only do we want there to be a thriving private rented sector, we think it's a good thing. We actually think that being a private landlord, acting properly and professionally, exactly the way that the NLA members do, is a good and a worthwhile thing, and it actually contributes to society, and there's nothing wrong with that. And we want a government, therefore, that recognises that. That's why we wouldn't go in for the sort of blanket regulation that we've been talking about in a number of areas tonight. We would certainly not go down the route of removing the interest relief, as you will have gathered, for exactly the reasons I entirely agree with Steve around that. I must say, my take on the capital gains tax is also the same as his, but let's go ahead and have a look at it together. That's also why we don't want the rigidity of the fixed 3 years or the rate cappings, for a reason that we've already talked about. And again, on Article 4, again, I mean, Steve and I were both planning ministers at various points, so we both had to look at it in a broader concept, because Article 4 directions are part of a broader suite of planning powers. I also am opposed to blanket Article 4 directions. Of course, under certain circumstances, councils may be obliged to pay compensation, but that may not be good enough in the circumstances. But they can, as a concept, have a useful role, so I wouldn't want to throw them out the window either. Do remember, though, that any council has to have an evidence base for doing this, and of course, if they behave irrationally in a legal sense, then they are susceptible to legal challenge, and I'm sure that your professional advisor will be able to talk to you about that. So it's a question of getting a sensible balance at it, and I'm sorry if one or two councils have overdone it, but I wouldn't want to remove lots of valuable tool, again, for the responsible majority.
Okay, I'm going to take two last questions then. I'm afraid we're going to have to wind up. Marion, very quickly.
Yeah.
Those of us that have been long-term land owned our properties since before 1982.
Right.
When we disposed of our properties, what we used to be allowed to do was uplift our properties.
Yeah.
1982 was the last valuation.
Right,
So if I
I see.
bought my properties in 1974 and disposed of them in 1990, my capital gains base price would be the 1982 valuation as it's a valuation office. So that's what the gentleman was referring to.
Right.
The second part of this question, which I think
We won't actually have any time for an answer, I'm afraid, Marion. So I think your comment is...
To sort of emphasise what he said, is that if we do sell our properties and then reinvest in the market, rather than paying the capital gains tax there and then, what we have at one time, and what if you have a limited company, what you can do, is you can roll over so you invest the whole amount of the proceeds back into the market, creating more private rented sector and holding over in capital gains tax. And that's really, I think, quite an issue, which is maybe not being answered in the past.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, because that's clarified what at that point, and also put another point to the minister. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to wrap it up, because I know... I'm sorry, forgive me. Very briefly.
Very quickly, I'm actually really sympathetic to what Bob and Stephen said about Article 4, and I do think it is a very difficult balance to strike. I do think there are reasons for keeping it and making sure it's at the discretion of local authorities, but I would prefer to see it really, really targeted. And there are problems where it's brought in and then actually some people want to move out of the area and can't because the house values have come down. There's all sorts of problems with it, but I would not want to take it away from councils, but I acknowledge that in some cases it may be difficult. And then on, I don't have any proposals to change CGT, I'm afraid. Ed Balls would probably beat me up, so I think that would be a bad idea. And then on buy-to-let mortgages, I think, where's the gentleman? I think if we were to change the legislation, firstly, we're already talking to the mortgage industry. Obviously, Nationwide and some others already give more flexibility than some of the banks. Some landlords own outright rather than having to pay mortgages as well. But I do think if we were to change the legislation and change the framework, that the mortgage industry would come with us too. I want to see a really thriving private rented sector. I want to make sure we can lever in private investment and like they do in other European countries, which we haven't managed to do here. There's actually consensus about that, but it is difficult to do. And I want to make sure that the rogue element of the landlord base doesn't bring down and besmirch the good name of the many professional and good landlords that are operating, and we do need those good landlords to continue and to provide homes for people in the most stable and secure way possible. And actually for landlords, you want the stability as well of the rent coming in, and you prefer to avoid voids. So I think we can, working together, make sure we get the conditions right.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Sadly, I'm afraid there is an MP waiting for this room and we're already a minute past our time, so we have to defer to the needs of parliamentary business. It just remains for me to thank you all for your contributions. I do apologise for anyone who didn't get a chance to participate because there was a time constraint. Thank you so much for the panel. I know they're busy. It's been an interesting and lively debate. Thank you for your comments, and I hope you will have taken on board what has been said tonight. Can I tell everyone that we will email all attendees with some photographs of this event, and we will be asking for your feedback. So thank you very much again. If I could ask you all to make your way to the exit door, do have a safe and pleasant journey home.